This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you, Kevin and Greg. I appreciate the intro. I am here with Katica Roy of Pipeline Equity and Bryan Leach of Ibotta. We'll be chatting briefly here about growth, what it means to them, and tips and tricks to achieve it. I'll start off, Katica, if you want to introduce yourself and Pipeline Equity, go ahead.
Sure. My name is Katica Roy. I'm the CEO and founder of Pipeline. Pipeline is a cloud platform that increases the financial performance of companies through closing the intersectional gender equity gap, so gender plus race and ethnicity. We actually did a study across 4,000 companies in 29 countries, and what we found was that for every 10% increase, there's a 1 to 2% increase in revenue.
Bryan, go ahead.
Thanks for having me, Nick. I'm Bryan Leach. I'm the founder and CEO of Ibotta. Ibotta is the leading cashback rewards platform in the United States. We have about 40 million people who use our platform to earn cashback on everyday items. We've paid coming up on about $1 billion in cashback rewards to American consumers. And we're based in Denver, about 750 employees. I've been doing this for about 8 years.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. Let's jump right in here. So growth is often used as a buzzword in the tech and startup world, but both of you know that there's a lot of work that goes into achieving it. It's more than just a term. How do you define growth at your company? And Katica, why don't you lead us off?
Well, revenue obviously is the top metric that we always measure, but I think that as a leader, and particularly in a startup, you need to measure your progress along the way. So we really look at all the different positive things that happen, and there can be many of those things in a week because being in a startup is a roller coaster. And so understanding all of your forward momentum, all of your forward progress is an important metric to really also keep your team motivated, because being in a startup is not easy.
Bryan, follow up on that?
Yeah, I agree with Katica. I think, look, there are a number of different aspects of growth. There's the pure financial performance. So what's my compound annual growth rate in terms of my net revenue and so forth? That's pretty straightforward. The ones that I think are maybe less often talked about are, how am I growing as measured by my mission? So for instance, when I talk about, we're now getting to a point where we're giving people $300 million a year in rewards versus $100 million versus $10 in the first month or whatever it was. So there's growing in service of our mission. And then there's, I think, just personal growth as a leadership team as we've gone through more things together and faced more challenges. And I think you can't really lead a growth company without signing up for a whole lot of having to go through growth yourself. And growth is actually very uncomfortable from a personal standpoint. So I hope we'll get into talking a little bit about the lived experience of running a growth company as well.
Yeah, let's continue along that thread. Bryan, now that we've defined the term, what are some of those important lessons that you've learned? What are some of those uncomfortable things that you've learned along the process?
Yeah, generally speaking, I would say that you're onto something when you're uncomfortable. When you are disrupting an industry, you are by definition doing something that the majority of people would assume is not possible. And if you've done that once, you've maybe been labeled a growth company. But as you get to 100, 200, north of $200 million in revenue, what I've seen is that what it takes to move the needle on a percentage basis is an even bolder, even more audacious, even more disruptive idea. And so if you don't maintain the mindset of the next big disruptive innovation, you'll never be able to outdo the last act. And so as you're bringing new investors in and they're putting in hundreds of millions of dollars and expecting to see their money go 3 to 5x over a matter of a few years, the burden that places on you to spend your time on things that could really move the needle against that definition is totally different than what you would spend your time on or focus on when you're running a much smaller company. Even if that company was growing at a higher rate, the absolute dollars that you have to add every year just totally change the way you think about running the company.
Katica, over to you. What are some of the lessons you've learned in growing Pipeline Equity?
I'm the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee, so my perspective of like growth being uncomfortable, but also my perspective is different because in terms of sort of generally, because I was raised with this idea that like I'm privileged to have been born in this country and to have the opportunities that I was given. And so the two things that I was really that I was raised with were to never give up and to always do your best. And I think that's really good advice in general, but it's particularly good when you're in a startup, because there's as Bryan talks about, when you are bringing something, creating a new market and being disruptive, there's a lot of fear to push through, right? You can believe in what you're going to do, but you're going to have a fair amount of people who will come. They're well intended, but they will push back on you. And so this idea of just, one, that always do your best and to never give up. The other piece that for us that was particularly important is that it wasn't about us, that there are millions of employees that we actually impact, and that if we can focus on them and the work that we're doing and the ripple that we send out, right? Because if you have equity of opportunity for instance, a breadwinner mom, it doesn't only impact her, it impacts her family, and it doesn't only impact them more immediately, it also impacts their lives for their future, right? And their future economic opportunity. And for us, that was a big part of, and is a big part of our ethos.
We talked about some of the lessons learned, and this event is largely focused on celebrating companies in the local ecosystem that are growing, whether they're early stage startups to more established companies continuing growth. But growth isn't an automatic, and it often comes with struggles. What are some of the hurdles or challenges you and your company have overcome in achieving the growth you've achieved thus far? Either of you can grab that one first.
Yeah, I'll jump in briefly. I mean, I think that we're building consumer technology. And so it's very difficult to know what consumers want until you put it in front of them. This is the classic, if you ask the consumers in the 1915 to 1920 period what they want, they would have told you a faster horse and buggy. And sometimes that's just irreducible learning process. And it's a very humbling process, because you think based on pattern recognition or research that you've done or other learnings, and you're just dead wrong. And you put a lot of effort and credibility behind something with, we have 500 full-time employees who believe that if I say this is going to be the next thing, it will be the next big thing. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. So what do you do when it isn't? How do you own that and embrace that as part of the process of innovation and iteration, and not have everyone say, man, this guy doesn't know where he's leading this company. And then how do you have the courage to make the next bold bet? I mean, it's like striking out a couple times, 3 times, maybe you're 0 for 10. You keep swinging at the curveball that's outside the strike zone. How do you have confidence that in that next at bat you're going to can come through for your team? And I think you just have to have a certain reservoir of self-belief, but I also think surrounding yourself with people who encourage you and make it feel like a joint decision, I think is really important to having the kind of patience to become the overnight success after 5-10 years of trial and error.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what Bryan says. I think that being a female founder, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about gender and what that looks like for female founders, that there's not often as much opportunity for us to fail forward. That doesn't mean we can't, but it's just something to be aware of, that the headwinds, any entrepreneur faces a tremendous amount of headwinds anytime you're being disruptive. And if you are female, you face even stronger headwinds. I think that's, and not to listen to the naysayers. I think, for us, we did a pivot a couple of years ago, and that was really helpful. It was when we were in the Techstars program, and it was really helpful in terms of our growth and helping us grow faster. And I think, also I would say for the people, you have to both coach people, but also know how to make tough talent decisions, because in a startup in particular, every single person matters. And so some of those decisions can be really difficult to make, but if you don't make them, they could actually lead to your failure.
Mm-hmm. And continuing along the thread of challenges, the current pandemic has made it harder than ever for many startups and tech companies to succeed. For most, and Katica, you just mentioned the idea of pivot. The pandemic has forced them to alter their roadmaps or pivot their company with very little notice. How have each of you and your companies dealt with the challenges associated with the current pandemic? Katica, why don't you lead us off?
Sure. So, we have a fairly large voice externally in terms of our branding. I write for a number of publications, including NBC and Fortune and World Economic Forum. So when the pandemic hit, we knew that probably people were not going to be talking about gender equity software for a little while, and so we thought, well, what can we do to be of service? How can we really be of service at this moment? And so what we actually did, using our data and our knowledge, was to launch a couple of campaigns. And one of those was around using gender mainstreaming, which is essentially applying a gender lens to economic stimulus, which unfortunately in the US hasn't been done right now, and not to date, but things like understanding that if you give $1,200 to a single mom and $500 for each of her kids, her expenses are not substantially less than if she was a family of four. And that not only is the right thing to do, but it also has an economic impact to our recovery. So that was one of the things that we did, and wrote, quite a bit, did an interview with the B20, did speaking engagement with the G7. There's a lot of things that we have made an impact on. And then the second really was actually focusing on female founded startups, because we receive less than 3% of all venture funding. So in 2019, female founded startups actually, as a cohort, across the entire startup ecosystem, actually received less funding than one company, which was WeWork. And so understanding that in a time when you're probably going to have reduced revenues and you're trying to figure out what's going to look like, that supporting female founded startups and really the PPP money in general was not gender lensed, right? That is of critical importance because it's important for our economic recovery. Then in actual fact, we need to be supporting innovations that are going to spur recovery. So we did those two things. And then we also launched a new product, which was called Pipeline Talent Finder, which was really targeted, and companies are still grappling with this, but the idea was that if you if someone in your company gets COVID, you need to figure out how to move somebody into their role. Like, it could be a mission critical role, and you may not have that information about your talent. So we launched Pipeline Talent Finder, and what we find is that for 86% of those times, we can actually find someone who can backfill that role essentially at the push of a button. So how we, really helped companies to manage in a time when they weren't going to be able to hire people, they were going to have to deal with talent disruptions pretty quickly.
Awesome. Bryan, what has Ibotta done during this pandemic to continue growing and continue your business?
Look, I'll be happy to lay out a few things. The first thing I want to say is just to acknowledge that it's hard. It's difficult for everybody. And if your business is struggling, it's not your fault, most likely. And any business is struggling and adapting. And I think one thing that a lot of entrepreneurs tend to do is just only talk about how gloriously they've done and come out ahead and all that. And it really invalidates the experience of people who are quite worried about the future of their business. And I've experienced that terror myself this year at various points. In the first part of this year, we saw the promotional landscape really change as people weren't shopping in the normal ways. They weren't going to stores. Brands were taking a wait and see approach on promoting traffic on their websites and stores. And that was a first in our business. And so it was scary, and it required us to reforecast our business. It required us to become much more conservative with our expenditures to solve for a longer runway because we didn't know how it would play out. As it turns out, one of the things that's happened is that changing in consumer purchase habits has led to far more people buying things like groceries online, which is a really exciting opportunity for our company because we're the only company that provides cashback rewards for online groceries. And now all of a sudden that's a big deal. That's not 5%, that's 25% of US grocery shopping. So the silver lining can be found in the ashes or the rubble of your latest round of layoffs if you're really focused on it, I think. And I think we've sort of had an Apollo project, as we called it, to really rotate into building the tools that would capitalize on that moment. We found retailers much more interested in working with us because they're worried about Amazon and worried about e-commerce. So there have been a number of things that have actually catalyzed innovation that maybe we wouldn't have pursued. And you see that in a lot of economic downturns. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's difficult. And the experience of kind of being on that roller coaster, reforecasting with your board of directors, having to level with your employees, having to furlough employees or lay off employees, and then rehire employees as we're now doing to catch up as fast as we can. The company's rebounding. It's been a whirlwind, really big whirlwind, and then you add into that social justice, racial justice conversations, a controversial election. If you can survive as a founder or entrepreneur this year, I think you're going to be great. You're going to do just great. This is building your metal for at least a decade.
Absolutely. Before we get out of here, I just want to ask one last question to each of you. If you could leave viewers with one piece of advice on growing a company, what would that be? Bryan, why don't you take this one first?
Yeah, I think the best piece of advice I could give is to not try to do it entirely by yourself. That you are always going to have a high degree of ownership and a sense of personal responsibility for the outcome. But there are things that are not, just as your success is going to be the team's success, setbacks are not your fault. So they need to be a team effort on both sides. And you need to, I think Katica had great advice. Think about everything through the lens of the mission, not about whether or not you're going to be judged as having doing the best job, right job, wrong job, or how it reflects on you. Just, are you advancing the mission? And if nothing else, come hell or high water, you advance the mission for a period of time, which is a wonderful thing. And I think managing the mental health aspect of leading during these times is really important. I'm very outspoken about mental health. I talk publicly about having a coach, having a therapist. I think validating that for other people who are going through this and for other entrepreneurs on this call is really part of something I'm really passionate about. So I want to underscore there's nothing wrong with that. That's good. That's healthy. That's necessary for leaders, and try to not take on too much personal responsibility, but think about it through the lens of your mission.
Advice. I'm not. I always shy away from advice. I always think, what would I tell myself if I was younger? What would I want to hear if I was a younger founder, or when I was first starting? I think that what I would say is to focus on. I think to separate your worth from your roller coaster ride, right? I think if you can separate yourself from that, you can stay more even keel and deal with the ebbs and flows of actually managing a startup, which really is a roller coaster, quite frankly. And that would be something that I would say, really focusing on those that you are responsible for. I mean, I think, one of the things, I was talking to a friend sort of in the middle of the pandemic, and I had the pandemic, but my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer at the end of last year. So we moved her to live with us right before all of this hit. She passed away 6 weeks ago, but we had that as well. And so it was sort of everything. There was a lot of things in the sort of the early March timeframe that I thought, I think I'm just going to take it one day at a time, because I'm not quite sure, but I also know that if I just do whatever I'm supposed to be doing, I think that maybe is a piece of advice, is rather than sort of forecasting way, way far out, my focus has always been, what do I have to do that's right in front of me? Rather than sort of like, you have the fear, but rather than giving into the fear, which can be debilitating. I'm a breadwinner mom. I was now supporting a family of 5 during a pandemic and a startup, sort of add those layers on. And if I could just focus on what I needed to be doing right now, like, what could I do right now? And if I could just do that, I could move through the fear, and I could actually have forward momentum, even if it didn't feel like I did. I think the other thing too, that I also stayed very, very close to our major stockholders, that the people that own the majority, who are major stockholders in Pipeline, I did not sugarcoat what was happening and what it was like to navigate it this year. And I stayed in really close, and I was like, I'll do everything I can, but it's also a tough year. And so I think, that was also something that carried us through very well, because they trust me. They trust me because they know that I will be honest with them no matter what, but also that I will keep going no matter what. And I think those two things coupled together have allowed them to have a lot of trust in me and trust in the Pipeline team.
Absolutely. Well, I think that brings us to the end here. Thank you again so much, Katica and Bryan. I think we got a ton out of that short discussion, and I hope our viewers enjoyed it as much as I did. With that, I will kick it back to Kevin. Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you both. I really, really appreciate it. We'll be sure to follow up with you guys as the event gets closer, and if we've got any questions, we'll be sure to reach out. Jane, is there anything on your end?
It looked great, guys. So thank you very much for your participation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Katica,
All right.
nice to meet you. Thanks for
Nice to meet
arranging
you
this
too,
today,
Bryan.
Jan. Good luck.
Have a
All
great
right.
day,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
guys.